To begin this morning, I have a reading from the book Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. Emergence is the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. In the framework of emergence, the whole is a mirror of the parts. Existence is fractal. The health of the cell is the health of the species and the planet. There are examples of emergence everywhere. Birds don't make a plan to migrate, raising resources to fund their way, packing for scarce times, mapping out their pit stops. They feel a call in their bodies that they must go, and they follow it, responding to each other, each bringing their adaptations. There is an art to flocking, staying separate enough not to crowd each other, aligned enough to maintain a shared direction, and cohesive enough to always move toward each other, responding to destiny together. Destiny is a calling that creates a beautiful journey. Emergence is beyond what the sum of its parts could even imagine. A group of caterpillars or nymphs might not see flight in their future, but it's inevitable. It's destiny. Oak trees don't set an intention to listen to each other better, or agree to hold tight to each other when the next storm comes. Under the earth, always, they reach for each other. They grow such that their roots are intertwined and create a system of strength that is as resilient on a sunny day as it is in a hurricane. Dandelions don't know whether they are a weed or a brilliance, but each seed can create a field of dandelions. We are invited to be that prolific and to return fertility to the soil around us. Cells may not know civilization is possible. They don't amass as many units as they can sign up to be the same. No, they grow until they split, complexify. Then they interact and intersect and discover their purpose. I'm a lung cell, I'm a tongue cell, and they serve it. And they die, and what emerges from these cycles are complex organisms, systems, movements, societies. Nothing is wasted or a failure. Emergence is a system that makes use of everything in the iterative process. It's all data. Ours is an emergent faith. The Time for All Ages this morning was inspired by actual events that took place in the late 1940s and early 1950s when the youth groups of Unitarian and Universalist churches made the decision to merge, which happened nearly 10 years before the wider governance of each faith community formally followed suit. I love sharing that story, which might not surprise you. It's a great way to lift up the importance of youth in our faith. They literally led the way as Unitarian Universalism was becoming. How cool is that? They were the early adopters. They were the birds that felt a call in their bodies and followed it. In the early and mid-1900s, prior to the merger, liberal faith communities were engaged in a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions, to use Brown's metaphor. In other words, there were a lot of conversations and ideas flying around. And Unitarian Universalism emerged from that time. Maybe it was destiny. Cells interacting, intersecting, and discovering their purpose. So often in human society, change comes from the margins, and so youth groups living in the midst of that time, bumping into each other, recognizing the commonality of their purpose, choosing to complexify together, makes a lot of sense. the seed of change starting and spreading. The organizing meeting of the Unitarian Universalist Association was held in Boston, Massachusetts in May of 1961. And core to that formation was the expansion of how we defined and articulated the practice of covenant, growing it from being a vertical relationship between God and people to also including a horizontal covenant between binding us to one another. As Reverend Bill Sinkford describes it, covenant can tap into our deepest sense of what is holy and our deepest sense of what is important. It goes to the heart of the matter. I'll say again, ours is an emergent faith. Upon our formation, we made central the work of articulating how we aspire to be with one another. Remember the art of flocking, staying separate enough not to crowd each other, aligned enough to maintain a shared direction, cohesive enough to always move toward one another. Just as there is movement when we picture a flock of birds, our faith is also changing and moving. We are engaged in emergence. In 1961, the original covenant of the member congregations of the UUA was articulated through 6 principles. By the mid-1980s, though, the original principles weren't working for everyone. Reverend Bill Sinkford, again, points out, covenants are formed and shaped at the denominational level in response to groundswells of opinion, which sounds a lot like flocks of birds to me. By the 80s, there were several groundswells of opinion, including the women's movement in Unitarian Universalism, who pushed hard for new principles because the original language of the principles was rife with male domination language. Additionally, many Unitarian Universalists at the time were finding their own spiritual path following earth-centered traditions. Those folks said the sources were incomplete because they failed to name said traditions. A few years ago, I was on Star Island, and I found myself by chance sitting next to a man who had actually participated in the revision of our principles and purposes in the 80s. He shared with me that humanists in the room at the time were a big reason why the decision was made to separate our principles from our sources of spiritual nourishment. If you look at the original 1961 principles, you'll see the 2 pieces were integrated. Our source is named within the articulated principles. I wonder if you can imagine how many meetings and subcommittees and studies and outreach campaigns must have been involved in order to finally create a new articulation of a covenant for the member congregations of the UUA. But that's what they did in the 1980s, and they passed in 1987 the principles and purposes we still know today. But we are again, right now, in a time of significant groundswells. Last year at General Assembly, the annual gathering of member congregations of the UUA, a commission was charged to review Article 2 of the UUA bylaws and propose any revisions that will enable our UUA, our member congregations, and our covenanted communities to be a relevant and powerful force for spiritual and moral growth, healing, and justice. People in our faith are again deep in the work of meetings, subcommittees, studies, and outreach campaigns in order to once again articulate what is most important to us. There are some really big ideas alive in our faith communities right now. There is a groundswell pushing to advocate for the formal adoption of an 8th principle, articulating a commitment to the dismantling of white supremacy within the stated principles of our faith. Already, many individual congregations have adopted the eighth principle. I know of more than one congregation whose children and youth have adopted the eighth principle, but whose adult congregants are still in discernment about it. Perhaps that's a pattern in our faith. Paula Cole-Jones, the faith leader who first proposed the eighth principle, is also spreading a powerful metaphor for how we might consider describing our Unitarian Universalist communities. We are a big tent, she says, referencing Universalist theology, but we are using little tent metaphors which shrink our potential. Paula identifies the prevalent metaphor of church as a family, to be a deeply limiting lens. She suggests we should instead imagine ourselves as a community of many communities. This alternate metaphor might allow us to embrace the very real truth that our faith holds a multitude of identities. We are not all the same, and we are also not alone in our differences. A metaphor that better articulates who we are will serve us well. The charge to the Article 2 Commission states that the new principles and purposes should guide us in the transformation of ourselves, our communities, and our faith into active networks of collective care, restoration, and justice. The principles and purposes should be a living document that challenges Unitarian Universalists to place the liberation in all its dimensions of all at the center of our lives. They should be honest about our past, name what we are facing and our aspirations and where we hope to be, not just today, but looking out at the horizons. They should ask us to choose love in action as the path forward. Existence is fractal, says Adrienne Marie Brown. The health of the cell is the health of the species and the planet. So much of what I see alive in our larger faith is also alive here in the South Church community. We too are asking hard questions of one another and thinking about what is most important about who we are. I invite you to engage with your siblings in faith beyond the walls of our congregation. Consider attending General Assembly in June. Look up the Article 2 Commission. Read about the eighth principle and the metaphor consider the metaphor that we might be a community of communities rather than one big family. The months ahead of us, perhaps even more this year than the year that has passed, will call on us to recognize our interdependence, to interact and intersect, to discover our shared purpose, and to serve it. What is the call you feel in your body? What adaptation will you bring to our flight?